Welcome to Ecoholics. We are going to look into incidence of tax today. We will understand what we mean by incidence and also what impacts the incidence of taxation for any producer or consumer. So, incidence of tax. Whenever the government imposes a tax on any person, may it be the producer or the consumer, we call this as the immediate impact of taxation. But just because the government is effectively taxing or collecting tax from one person does not mean that the entire burden of taxation falls on the same person. This burden may be transferred to some other person. For example, if the producer has been paying the taxes to the government, the producer may shift tax to the customer. Or in case the customer is paying taxes, the customer may shift the burden to the producer. So, impact and incidence of taxation are two separate terminologies that must not be confused here. Incidence refers to the ultimate location or the direct money burden of the tax. It signifies the settlement of tax burden on the ultimate taxpayer. So the ultimate person who will be bearing the problem or the pinch of tax. It is the ultimate result of shifting, whereas impact refers to the initial burden of tax, while incidence refers to the ultimate burden. Impact may be shifted, but incidence is never shifted. We have different types of tax shifting. We have forward shifting of tax, which is the tax shifted from the seller to the purchaser, and we also have backward shifting, which is the shifting of the tax from the purchaser to the seller. In the case of forward shifting, the degree, or we can say the incidence of taxation depends upon the elasticity of demand. Whenever the elasticity of demand is higher, then the burden on the consumer will be much lesser. Whereas with respect to the elasticity of supply, supply is the main domain of the the seller. So here we have the degree of backward incidence depends on the elasticity of supply. Higher the elasticity of supply, lesser is the burden on the producer. Let us understand both of them through a diagram. So here we have the demand and supply curve for a given commodity. In case, say, an ad valorem tax is imposed here, we will see a parallel shift, or rather an inward parallel shift of the supply curve. So here we have the new equilibrium generated at a given price, which is inclusive of taxation and quantity post-tax. So we have a pre-tax equilibrium, price and quantity, and we have the post-tax equilibrium. We can see that out of this entire segment, or rather this entire segment is the incidence that will fall on the consumer. The size of this rectangle is defined by the elasticity of the demand curve. Also, this segment is corresponding to the incidence on the supplier. So here we have the producer's incidence, and this incidence is dependent upon the elasticity of the supply curve. The more elastic the supply curve is, the lesser will be the incidence on the producer, because he will be able to restrict the output whenever taxes are higher. So again, for a consumer, in case his elasticity of demand is inelastic, for a necessity commodity, for example, in case the government imposes tax, the consumer will still continue to buy the same commodity. So the lesser the elasticity of demand is for the consumer, higher the burden of tax for the consumer here. We also have the two extreme scenarios in which only the consumers or the producers pay the entire burden of tax. So, when does the consumer only bear the entire tax? It is when the demand curve is completely inelastic. In this scenario, even if the supply curve shifts inwards, the entire amount of tax, which is the gap between the supply curve, it is equivalent to the increase in the prices. So, whenever price elasticity of demand is equal to 0, consumers bear the entire burden of tax. Also, whenever price elasticity of supply is infinite, or we have a perfectly elastic supply, then the consumers bear the entire burden of tax, because here the producers can easily stop production or change production according to their own needs. Lastly, when do producers bear the entire burden of tax? This happens when the supply curve is inelastic. Here we say that whenever elasticity of supply is equal to 0, then the producers will not have any say in producing or stopping the production. So here, in such a scenario, the producers will bear the entire burden of tax. Also, whenever the price elasticity of demand is infinite, the producer will be scared. When price elasticity of demand is infinite, in this scenario, the producer will fear that the customer might move away to some other producer. So here, the entire burden of taxation will be taken up by the producer. So this is a rough overview of what happens in case of incidence of tax. For more content, please like, subscribe and share to Ecoholics channel. Have a good day. Thank you.